Maya Torres walked through the massive halls of the Galactic Council station with her heart pounding in her chest and her hands clenched tight at her sides because she knew something was wrong even before the guards moved to block her path with their weapons raised and their faces cold and emotionless behind. Their helmets beside her walked Serenus, who moved with the grace of someone who had lived for centuries and whose pale silver hair fell like moonlight down her back, and whose violet eyes saw things that humans could not see, and whose presence always made Maya feel both protected and small in a way she could not explain outside. The station in the cold darkness of space, Kale waited with his enormous body curled around one of the docking spires and his scales shimmering with colors that shifted between deep blue and bright silver, and his eyes glowing with an intelligence that was ancient and knowing and patient. Maya had come to warn the Council about the darkness she had seen in the outer rim, where dead worlds suddenly showed signs of activity, and where ancient machines were waking up from their long sleep, and where entire colonies had gone silent without any explanation. She had brought evidence and data and recordings that showed the threat was real and growing, and she had hoped that the Council would listen and act before it was too late. But the Council chamber was filled with hostile faces, and the representatives of the Zenthari Empire leaned forward in their seats with their reptilian features twisted into expressions of contempt, and the Vrex collective delegates watched with their multiple eyes. Unblinking and calculating, the head counselor was a tall Zenthari named Vexer, who stood up from his seat and pointed one clawed finger at Maya, and his voice echoed through the chamber when he spoke about crimes and treason and lies. Maya felt her blood turn cold as she listened to the accusations, because they were claiming that humans had been building illegal weapons and breaking treaties and planning to attack the Council itself. Evidence they showed on the massive screens was convincing and detailed, but Maya knew it was false because she recognized her own signature on documents she had never signed, and saw images of weapons facilities that did not exist, and heard recordings of conversations she had never had. Serenus stepped forward, and her voice was calm, but carried a power that made the entire chamber fall silent, and she spoke in the old tongue that only the eldest races remembered, and she told them they were being deceived and manipulated. But Vexer only laughed and said that the elves had fallen long ago and had no authority here anymore, and that their magic and their dragons were relics of a dead age that had no place in the modern galaxy. The vote came quickly and without mercy, and the Council declared humanity to be a threat that must be eliminated, and all human colonies were to be seized, and all human ships were to be destroyed, and all human representatives were to be arrested and tried for war crimes. Maya tried to speak, but the guards moved toward her with their weapons charging up, and she saw on the screens behind the Council that human stations were already under attack, and that ships were burning, and that people were dying. Serenus moved faster than anyone could follow, and her hands glowed with silver light, and the guards were thrown backward by a force that bent the air itself. And Kale roared from outside the station, and the sound was so loud and so deep that the walls shook and the lights flickered. Maya ran with Serenus pulling her along, and behind them the Council was shouting orders, and alarms were screaming through every corridor, and security doors were slamming shut. But Serenus knew the old passages that ran through the station because she remembered when it had been built. Centuries ago they reached a small docking bay where a stolen ship waited, and Kale was already there, having torn through the outer hull to reach them, and his massive head lowered so they could climb onto his back. The dragon launched into space with powerful movements of his wings that should not have worked in vacuum but did, because dragon magic was older than physics and deeper than science. Maya clung to the scales on Kale's back and watched through tears as her home station exploded in a ball of fire that spread silently through the void, and she knew that thousands of people had just died because the Council wanted to eliminate competition series. Wrapped her arms around Maya and whispered words of comfort in the old language, and Kale flew faster than any ship could follow, and they escaped into the darkness. Between stars behind them, the Council celebrated their victory and sent their fleets to hunt down the remaining humans, and declared that the threat had been contained. But Maya made a promise to herself as she watched her world burn, and that promise was cold and hard and absolute. She would survive, and she would find other survivors, and she would build something that the council had never seen before. She would build an empire from the ashes of betrayal, and that empire would be strong enough to make the galaxy tremble. Saronis felt the change in Maya through the bond they shared, and she knew that the gentle human officer she had saved years ago was gone, and in her place was someone harder and colder and more dangerous. Scale also felt it, and he sent feelings of approval through his connection with Serenus, because dragons respected strength and determination and the will to fight. Against impossible odds, they flew through hyperspace for days without stopping, and Maya used the ship's communications to send out coded messages to any human ships that might still be out there. Some answered and told stories of massacre and betrayal and desperate escapes. Others did not answer, and Maya knew they were probably dead or captured, or hiding too deep to risk communication, but enough answered to give her hope, and she told them all to head for coordinates in the fringe where the council's reach was weak and where they could gather and plant Serenes. Told Maya about the old elven sanctuaries that were hidden throughout the galaxy, and about the technology and knowledge that lay dormant there waiting to be claimed. She explained that she was not just a wanderer, but the last princess of the Elven Concordat, and that her people had once ruled the stars before falling to civil war, and Pride Kale was bound to her bloodline by ancient magic. He was one of the last great dragons, and his kind had been sleeping for millennia, waiting for the time when they would be needed. Again, Maya listened and learned and began to form a plan that was audacious and dangerous and wired. Maybe impossible, but impossible had never stopped humans before, and it would not stop her. Now, when they finally reached the fringe, they found a scattered group of human ships hiding in an asteroid field, and among them were military officers and scientists and civilians who had lost everything. Maya stood before them in the cargo bay of the largest ship and told them what had happened and what she planned to do. Some were afraid and wanted to run deeper into the darkness and hide forever, but others looked at her with fire in their eyes and agreed that humanity would not die quietly in the shadows. Darloren Hayes stepped forward, and she was young but brilliant, and she had managed to save some experimental technology before her research station was destroyed. Commander Nina Brooks was there too, with her uniform torn and dirty, but her spine straight and her voice strong when she pledged. Her loyalty pilot Carla Jensen had lost her entire squadron, but she still had her ship and her skills and her rage. Together, they represented what remained of humanity's strength, and Maya knew it was not much, but it was enough to start Serenus. The images of the nearest elven sanctuary, and explained how they could reach it and what they might find there. Though sanctuary was on a dead world that had been abandoned for thousands of years, but its defenses were still active and its treasures were still intact. Maya gave the order to move out, and the small fleet left the asteroid field and headed deeper into the fringe toward a future that was uncertain, but at least was theirs to shape. Behind them, the council continued their purge and believed that humanity was finished, but they were wrong, because humanity had something the council did not have. They had nothing left to lose and everything to gain, and they had allies who remembered what it meant to fight for survival. And they had Maya Torres, who had been cast out and betrayed but who refused to accept defeat. Journey to the Elven Sanctuary took weeks, and during that time Maya trained with Serenes in combat and strategy, and learned about the old ways of Power Kale. Flew alongside their ships, and his presence kept them safe from pirates and scavengers who might have attacked such a small fleet. They finally arrived at the dead world. Maya stood on Kale's back and looked down at the ancient ruins that covered the surface, and she felt hope for the first time since the betrayal. This was where their empire would begin. This is where humanity would rise again. The galaxy would learn to fear the name Maya Torres. The Elven Sanctuary rose from the dead world like a ghost from the past, with towers that reached into the sky and walls that shimmered with power, even after thousands of years of abandonment, and Maya felt small standing before it while Kale circled overhead, casting shadows that moved across the ancient Serenus placed her hand on the main gate and spoke words in the old language that made the air vibrate with energy, and slowly the massive doors began to open with a sound like thunder. Rolling across empty plains inside, they found halls filled with technology that seemed like magic and weapons, that hummed with contained power and knowledge stored in crystals that glowed with soft blue. Light dear Lauren Hayes moved through the sanctuary, like a child in a treasure room, touching everything and asking 1,000 questions that Serenes answered patiently, while Maya organized the salvage team's commander, Nina Brooks, set up a defensive perimeter around the sanctuary because even in the fringe they could not afford to be careless, and she posted guards at every entrance and had scouts patrol the surrounding. Arya Carla Jensen worked on integrating some of the elven technology into their ships, and she discovered that the power crystals could boost engine output by incredible amounts, and that the shields could be strengthened beyond anything human engineers had thought possible. Maya spent her nights in the sanctuary's library, learning everything she could about the elves, and their history, and their fall, because she knew that understanding the past was crucial to building a better future. Cernus told her stories of the Concordat. At its height, when elven ships sailed between stars and dragons were as common as birds, and when peace had seemed eternal, but pride had destroyed them, and civil war had torn their empire apart, and the survivors had scattered and hidden, and eventually forgotten what they had once been. Calais was living proof of that forgotten glory, and he was patient with the humans who were afraid of him at first, but slowly learned that he was intelligent and kind despite his massive size and terrible power. The dragon allowed children to climb on his back, and he would fly them around the sanctuary, making them laugh with joy, and for a moment they could forget the horror of what had happened to their people. Maya gathered the survivors every evening and spoke to them about her vision for the future. And she told them they would not just survive, but thrive, and that they would build something greater than what they had lost. Some believed her immediately because they needed hope more than they needed caution. Others took longer to convince, because they had seen too much death and betrayal, and could not easily trust in grand promises. But Maya was patient, and she led by example, working harder than anyone else, and never asking others to take risks she would not take. Herself, Di Hayes made the first breakthrough when she figured out how to combine human fusion technology with elven crystal power, and the result was an energy source that was compact and incredibly powerful and could run for years without refueling. The first prototype weapon they built could punch through the shields of any council ship, and Maya tested it herself on a captured probe and watched with satisfaction as it disintegrated in a flash of silver. Light Commander Brooks began training volunteers in new combat techniques that blended human tactics with elven magic, and soon they had a small but deadly force of warriors who could fight in ways the council had never seen. Carla Jensen completed the first hybrid warship, and they named it Defiance because that was what humanity represented now. And when it launched from the sanctuary, Maya felt pride swell in her chest. But they needed more than just technology and weapons, because an empire required people and resources and allies who could be trusted. Cernus reached out through old channels to scattered elven communities that had hidden themselves throughout the galaxy, and some responded with curiosity and caution. She told them about Kale, and about the sanctuary being opened, and about the humans who were willing to fight alongside elves as equals. The first elven ship arrived 3 months after they had opened the sanctuary, and its crew were shocked to see Kale alive and healthy because they had thought all the great dragons were extinct. Their leader was an elf named Theron, who was old even by elven standards, and who remembered the Concordat before its fall, and he wept when he saw Serenus and called her by her true royal title. Theron brought with him knowledge of other sanctuaries and other hidden resources, and he pledged his loyalty to Serenus, and through her to Maya. More elves came in the following weeks, and with them came their own dragons, who had been sleeping in hidden caves and forgotten vaults waiting for the call to awaken. The dragons were smaller than Kale, but still magnificent and powerful, and they bonded with warriors who proved themselves worthy through tests of courage and heart. Maya watched as the first human dragon rider took flight, and she knew that they had created something unprecedented, because humans and elves working together with dragons at their side was a combination that the galaxy had never seen. They established their first settlement in the asteroid field where they had originally hidden, and they called it New Haven, and it grew rapidly as more survivors found their way. their new haven became a fortress with shields, powered by elven crystals and weapons that could destroy entire fleets and defenses. That made it nearly impossible to attack. Maya established a council to govern New Haven, and she made sure that every voice was heard, whether human or elf, and that decisions were made fairly and open lies or no's. Served as her advisor and closest friend, and together they planned the next phase of their strategy, which was to strike back at the council and show the galaxy that humanity was not defeated, but before they could attack, they needed intelligence about council movements and weaknesses, and that meant sending out scouts and spies into dangerous territory. Commander Brooks volunteered to lead the first reconnaissance mission, and she took a small team in a stealth ship that had been modified with elven cloaking technology. They spent weeks gathering information and recording fleet positions and identifying supply lines, and when they returned, they brought news that made Maya smile. The council was overconfident and had spread their forces thin, and they believed humanity was crushed and hiding in fear. Maya called a meeting of her commanders and showed them the intelligence and outlined her plan for their first strike. They would hit a Xanthari mining operation that used slave labor from conquered worlds, and they would free the slaves and take the resources and leave a message that could not be ignored. The operation would be dangerous because the mining facility was heavily guarded and council reinforcements could arrive quickly, but Maya was confident because they had superior technology and the element of surprise, and warriors who were fighting for something greater than them. Sylvestrinus insisted on going with Maya on the mission, and Kale would carry them both into battle. Dr. Hayes prepared special weapons for the assault, and Commander Brooks drilled the strike teams until they could execute the plan perfectly. Carla Jensen would lead the fighter squadron that would provide cover, and she handpicked her pilots from the best they had. Night before the mission, Maya stood on a balcony overlooking New Haven and watched as people went about their lives, building and creating and hoping. Xerenus joined her, and they stood in silence for a long time. Before the elf princess spoke about duty and sacrifice and the weight of leadership, Maya admitted that she was afraid, not of dying, but of failing the people who trusted her. And Serenes told her that fear was what made her strong, because it meant she landed beside them and lowered his great head so Maya could touch his scales, and through that contact, she felt his confidence and his strength. The dragon had chosen to fight for humanity, and that choice meant more to Maya than any weapon or technology, because it meant they were not alone. The next morning, the strike force departed from New Haven, with Defiance leading the way and dragon riders flying in formation around it. Maya rode on Kale's back with Serena's behind her, and she felt the wind of hyperspace rushing past them, even though there was no air. The journey to the mining facility took hours, and during that time, Maya reviewed the plan and checked her weapons and tried not to think about everything that could go wrong. When they arrived, they found the facility exactly where intelligence said it would be, and it was massive, with processing plants and landing bays and defensive platforms. Maya gave the signal, and the attack began with Defiance dropping out of hyperspace first and launching missiles that struck the shield generators. Kale and the other dragons followed, diving through the explosions with their scales glowing bright and their eyes blazing with battle fury. The Xanthari guards were caught completely by surprise, and they scrambled to respond, but the human and elven warriors were already inside their defenses. Maya leaped from Kale's back onto a landing platform and fought her way through the guards with a weapon that fired silver bolts of energy. Xerenus moved beside her, and her magic threw enemies aside like leaves in a storm. Commander Brooks led her team to the slave pens and began freeing the prisoners, who were from a dozen different species and who could barely believe they were being rescued. Carla Jensen and her fighters kept the council ships grounded and destroyed the communication arrays so no distress calls could get out. The battle lasted less than an hour, and when it was over, the facility was theirs and hundreds of freed slaves. 2 years had passed since the first strike, and Maya's empire had grown beyond anything she had imagined, with dozens of settlements spread across the fringe and a fleet of hybrid warships that made council admirals nervous when they appeared. On scanners, New Haven had transformed from a hidden fortress to a thriving city with towers that reached high into the artificial atmosphere and streets filled with humans and elves and freed slaves from 100 different worlds. The stellar wings had become legendary, And these were the Dragon Riders who fought in space with their massive mounts, breathing fire that could melt through hull plating and shields that no weapon could penetrate. Kale remained the largest and most powerful of all the dragons, and he had become a symbol of the Empire with his image displayed on every ship and every section. Maya stood in the command center, watching tactical displays that showed Council fleet movements and listening to reports from scouts who had infiltrated enemy territory. Azirnus was beside her as always, and the elf princess had grown into her role as spiritual leader of the Alliance, with thousands looking to her for guidance and wisdom. Commander Nina Brooks had been promoted to Admiral and now commanded the defense fleet that protected all their territories with an iron will and brilliant tactical minder. Lauren Hayes continued to push the boundaries of what was possible with technology, and her latest creation was a resonance cannon that could disrupt shield harmonics across multiple ships at once. Carla Jensen led the fighter corps and had trained hundreds of pilots who flew with skill and courage that rivaled any in the galaxy. But Maya knew that despite their growth, they were still vastly outnumbered by the Council forces, and that eventually there would be a confrontation that would decide everything. The message came during a quiet morning when Maya was reviewing supply reports, and it was from a Council admiral offering terms of surrender. The terms were insulting and demanded that Maya turn herself in for trial, and that all humans return to designated reservations. Under Council supervision, Maya deleted the message without responding, because she had learned that the Council only understood strength and that negotiation was pointless without leverage. Instead, she called a meeting of her war council and proposed something bold that would either win them the war or destroy everything they had built. She wanted to strike at the heart of Council territory and capture one of their major shipyards and use it to build even more ships for the Alliance. Admiral Brooks immediately saw the value of the plan, but also the enormous risk, because the shipyard was protected by 3 full battle groups and assault platforms that could shred anything that got close. Carla Jensen said her pilots were ready for anything and that they had been training for exactly this kind of operation. Cyrinus asked Kale what he thought, and the great dragons sent feelings of eagerness and confidence through their bond, because dragons loved a good challenge. Dar Hayes said she had new weapons ready for testing, and that this would be the perfect opportunity to see what they could really do. Maya made the decision and gave the order to prepare for the largest military operation the Alliance had ever attempted. Fleet assembled over the course of weeks, with every available warship being upgraded and supplied and every warrior being briefed on the mission. The Stellar Wings gathered as well, with 30 dragons and their riders, forming a strike force that could hit targets that conventional ships could not reach. Maya would lead the assault personally. Aboard the flagship Defiance, which had been rebuilt and upgraded so many times that it was barely recognizable from the original design, Cyrinus and Kale would be at the forefront as always, because their presence inspired everyone and because their power was needed for the plan to work. The journey to the Council shipyard took days through hyperspace, and during that time Maya walked through her ship, talking to crew members and making sure everyone understood how important this mission was. Some were nervous because they knew the casualties would be high, but none backed down because they all believed in what they were fighting for. When they finally dropped out of hyperspace, the shipyard appeared before them like a massive city floating in the void, with construction bays and defense platforms and hundreds of ships moving in organized patterns. The Council forces detected them immediately, and alarms began screaming across every frequency as battle groups moved to intercept. Maya gave the order to attack, and the Alliance fleet surged forward, with Defiance leading the charge and Dragon Riders streaming ahead like shooting stars. The space between the fleets filled with weapons, fire, and explosions, and ships that were torn apart by forces too powerful to resist. Kale dove through the chaos with Maya and Cyrinus on his back, and his roar echoed across all communication channels, making the Council forces hesitate in fear. The dragons focused on the defense platforms, using their fire to superheat the armor until it melted, and their claws to tear apart weapon systems. Alliance fighters swarmed around capital ships, keeping them distracted while the larger warships moved into position to fire their resonance cannons. When Dr. Hayes gave the signal, Maya felt the entire ship vibrate as the resonance cannon charged, and then a beam of pure energy shot forward, striking not just one ship but an entire formation. The Council shields flickered and failed as the harmonic. Disruption spread from ship to ship, and suddenly dozens of vessels were vulnerable, and defenseless Admiral Brooks took advantage immediately and sent her ships forward to rain missiles and energy weapons on the exposed hulls. The battle turned into a slaughter as Council ships tried to retreat but found themselves surrounded and outmaneuvered. Maya directed Kale toward the command station of the shipyard, and they landed on its hull with enough force to leave dents in the metal Sarunis used her magic to cut through the outer door, and they led a boarding party inside. Finding minimal resistance because most of the security forces had been deployed to defend the perimeter, the shipyard commander surrendered within minutes when he realized that dragonfire was melting through the walls toward his command center. Maya broadcast the surrender across all frequencies and ordered the Council forces to stand down or be destroyed. Some ships tried to flee, but the Alliance had positioned blockade forces at every exit point, and escape was impossible. By the end of the day, the shipyard belonged to Maya. Her empire had just gained the ability to build capital ships on a scale it never managed before. The cost had been high, with thousands dead and dozens of ships damaged or destroyed, but the victory was worth it because it changed the balance of power. Maya stood in the captured command center looking at the tactical displays showing Council territories, and she knew that everything had changed. The Council could no longer dismiss them as raiders or terrorists. Because they had just defeated 3 battle groups and captured a strategic asset. Messages began coming in from across the galaxy as word of the battle spread, and some were offers of alliance from species who wanted to join Maya's growing empire. Theirs were threats from the Council promising retaliation and destruction, but Maya ignored those because empty threats. Nothing Zeronis told her that more elven communities were reaching out, wanting to join the cause now that they saw the dragons flying again and the ancient ways being restored. Kale was tired from the battle, but satisfied, and he curled up in one of the massive docking bays to rest. While engineers worked around him, Admiral Brooks began organizing the defense of the shipyard and setting up supply lines to keep it operational and protected. Dr. Hayes immediately started examining the Council technology in the facility, looking for anything useful they could adapt or improve. Carla Jensen and her pilots celebrated their victory, but Maya reminded them that this was just one battle and that the war was far from over. That night, Maya received a communication from deep within Council, and it was from species who had been oppressed for generations and who saw Maya as a liberator. They offered intelligence about Council weaknesses and asked for help overthrowing their local governors. Maya realized that her empire was becoming something bigger than just human survival, and that she now had a responsibility to all those who looked to her for hope. Serenies Greedon said that this was what the Elven Concordat should have been before it fell to pride and isolation. Together they drafted a declaration that would be sent to every world in the galaxy, announcing the formation of the Free Starborn Alliance. Alliance would be open to any species that valued freedom and justice, and it would be governed by a council where every member had equal voice. Maya knew that such idealism would be tested and that there would be conflicts and disagreements, but she believed it was worth trying. The declaration was broadcast, and the response was overwhelming, with hundreds of worlds expressing interest and dozens immediately pledging their support. The Council responded by declaring Maya a galactic threat and putting a massive bounty on her head and sending their best assassins to kill her. But Maya had faced worse and survived, and she had Serena's and Kale protecting her, and an empire of loyal followers who would die before they let her fall through. War intensified over the following months, with battles erupting across a dozen sectors and ships burning on both sides. But the Alliance was winning because they had superior technology and better morale and warriors who believed in their cause. The Free Starborn Alliance controlled nearly a third of known space, and Maya had been named Empress by unanimous vote of the Council, though she insisted on keeping the democratic structure intact because power without accountability was exactly what they were fighting against. New Haven had become the capital of an empire that stretched across hundreds of systems, and the city now housed millions of beings from countless species who had found refuge and purpose under Maya's banner, the Stellar Wings numbered over 200 dragons and riders, and they had become the most elite fighting force in the galaxy. With their own academies and traditions and code of honor, Kale remained at the center of it all, and the ancient dragon had taken several younger dragons under his guidance, teaching them the old ways that had been forgotten during the long sleep. Serena served as high priestess and chief diplomat, and her wisdom had prevented many conflicts within the alliance's different species learned to work together, despite centuries of mistrust. Admiral Nina Brooks commanded a fleet of 500 warships that patrolled Alliance territory and defended against constant council raids and probing attacks. Lauren Hayes had been given her own research station where she continued pushing the boundaries of technology, and her latest breakthrough was a quantum communicator that could send messages instantly across any distance. Carla Jensen had become a legend among pilots, and she led an entire wing of elite fighters that could take on capital ships and win through sheer skill and audacity. But not everyone was happy with how the Empire was growing, and General Victoria Grant had become the voice of those who believed Maya was too soft on former enemies and too willing to accept aliens into positions of power. Victoria was human and proud of it, and she remembered the burning stations and the murdered families, and she wanted revenge, not reconciliation. She stood before Maya in the throne room that Maya had never wanted but had been forced to accept, and she argued passionately for a more aggressive strategy. Victoria wanted to hit council worlds directly and make them suffer the way humanity had suffered, and she had support among the military and the civilian population. Maya listened carefully because she knew that ignoring legitimate grievances was how leaders lost touch with their people, but she also knew that cruelty and revenge would turn the alliance into exactly what they were fighting. Agan Serena spoke up in support of Maya and reminded everyone that their strength came from unity and that hatred would destroy them faster than any enemy fleet. Victoria was not convinced, but she accepted the decision and returned to her duties, though Maya could see the resentment in her eyes. That night, Maya sat with Serenes on a balcony overlooking the city, and they talked about the burden of leadership and the impossible choices that came with power. Serenes told her about the Elven Concordat and how it had fallen apart because different factions could not agree on how to govern, and how pride had led to civil war. Maya understood the warning and made a note to meet with Victoria privately to address her concerns before they festered into something worse. But before she could arrange that meeting, Dr. Hayes burst into her quarters with news that changed everything. The ancient machines that had been awakening were now moving, and scouts had identified them as the Hollow Swarm, which was a name from legend so old that even elves had thought it was mytha. Hollow Swarm had destroyed countless civilizations millions of years ago and had been locked away by powers that no longer existed now. They were free, and they were consuming everything in their path, turning entire star systems into raw materials for building more machines. KS showed Maya the recordings, and they were horrifying because the swarm moved like a living thing, despite being mechanical, and it showed no mercy and no hesitation. Planets were stripped to bare rock in hours, and populations were harvested for organic components, and ships that tried to fight back were integrated into the swarm itself. Maya asked how long before the swarm reached inhabited space, and Hayes said it was already there because Council scouts had engaged the outer edge 2 days ago, and none had returned. Council was finally taking the threat seriously, but their response was chaotic and uncoordinated, because they still could not believe that anything could threaten their supremacy. Maya made a decision that would either save the galaxy or doom it, and she ordered her communications officer to send a message directly to the Council leadership. Message offered a full alliance and complete military cooperation against the Hollow Swarm in exchange for the Council dissolving and reforming as a true democracy. She did not expect them to agree, but she needed to try one more time because the stakes were too high for pride. The response came within hours, and it was from the head counselor Vexer himself, and his message dripped with contempt. He said that the Council would never bow to a human upstart, and that they would destroy the swarm themselves, and then they would finish what they started with humanity. His message also revealed fear because the swarm had already destroyed 3 Council battle groups and was accelerating toward the core worlds. Maya called a full war council, and every important leader of the Alliance gathered in person or via Hologram She showed them the evidence of the swarm and explained that this threat made their conflict with the council seem. Petty and insignificant Admiral Brooks agreed and suggested they begin evacuating border worlds and consolidating their forces for a defensive stand. Carla Jensen said her pilots were ready to fight, but asked if conventional weapons would even work against something that old and powerful. Dr. Hayes admitted she did not know, but said she was working on theories about how the swarm operated. Impossible. Weakness Aronis asked Kale what the dragons could sense, and through their bond he showed her images of darkness and hunger, and something fundamentally wrong with reality itself. Dragons were ancient enough to remember stories of the swarm out, and they knew that this enemy could not be negotiated with or reasoned with, only fought a Victoria. Grant stood up and said that this changed nothing, because the council had refused their help and humanity should focus on protecting their own. Maya felt anger flash through her but forced it down because losing her temper would only make things worse. Instead, she spoke calmly about duty and responsibility and the fact that letting the council fall would mean billions of deaths. She said that they would offer aid even if it was rejected, because that was what separated them from the council and made them better. Some agreed immediately and others took more convincing, but eventually the decision was made to send forces to help defend. Council Space Maya would lead the fleet personally, and Serenus and Kale would accompany her because their presence might be enough to convince the council to accept help. They assembled a battle group of 100 ships, including the Defiance and 20 Dragon Riders from the Stellar Wings. The journey to council space took days, and during that time Maya drilled her forces and prepared contingency plans for every scenario. She could imagine when they arrived at the council border, they were met by a defensive fleet that locked weapons on them and demanded they turn back. Maya broadcast on all frequencies that they had come to help fight the swarm and that old grudges needed to be set aside. The council admiral in charge was reluctant, but his sensors were showing the swarm approaching fast, and he knew his forces alone could not stop. I've allowed the Alliance fleet to pass, but assigned them to the most dangerous position on the front line where casualties would be highest. Maya accepted without complaint because she knew this was a test, and that proving their value was the only way to earn trust. The swarm arrived like a wave of darkness that blotted out stars, and its ships were organic-looking masses of metal that moved with disturbing coordination. The battle began when the swarm opened fire with weapons that ignored shields and tore through holes like they were paper. Council ships exploded by the dozens in their formations, broke apart as panic spread through the ranks. Maya ordered her ships to hold position and fire in coordinated volleys targeting the same swarm vessels to bring them down through concentrated firepower. The resonance cannons proved effective because they disrupted whatever field the swarm used to coordinate its movements. Dragon riders dove into the thick of battle with Kale leading them, and their fire seemed to hurt the swarm ships more than conventional weapons. Serenus stood on the Bridge of Defiance, channeling elven magic through the ship itself and creating barriers that deflected the worst of the swarm attacks. The battle raged for hours and casualties mounted on both sides, but slowly the Alliance tactics began to work. Maya saw an opening in the swarm formation and ordered a concentrated push to exploit it before the swarm could adapt. Admiral Brooks executed the maneuver perfectly, and suddenly Alliance forces were behind the swarm main line, hitting their command nodes. The swarm reacted by pulling back its forward elements to protect the nodes, and that gave the council forces time to regroup. Maya sent a message to the council admiral suggesting they coordinate their attacks, but he ignored her and ordered his ships to advance recklessly. Council forces walked into a trap and were surrounded by swarm ships that had been waiting for exactly that kind of mistake. Maya cursed and ordered her fleet to rescue the trapped council ships, even though it meant exposing her own forces to danger. Alliance ships fought their way through the swarm and created a The hollow swarm emerged from the galactic core like a plague made of metal and malice, and it consumed 3 council sectors in the first week, leaving nothing behind but stripped planets and the silence of extinction. Maya watched the tactical displays in horror as red markers appeared across the map, showing worlds going dark and fleets being obliterated and entire civilizations vanishing as if they had never existed. The council was in chaos, with admirals arguing over strategy and politicians fleeing to protected bunkers while the military struggled to mount any effective defense. Vexor finally sent a message directly to Maya, and his voice was stripped of its usual arrogance, placed by something that might have been fear or desperation. He asked for terms and offered to negotiate a ceasefire if the Alliance would help defend the core worlds. Maya looked at Serenus, who stood beside her with Kale's presence heavy in their shared bond, and she felt the weight of billions of lives resting on her decision. Part of her wanted to let the Council burn because they had earned their fate through arrogance and cruelty and betrayal. But Serenus placed a hand on her shoulder and reminded her that revenge was a poison that would corrupt everything. They had built, she said, that they were creating an empire, not for domination, but for preservation, and that every life mattered regardless of who had wronged them. Kale sent feelings through his bond with Serenus, and those feelings spoke of ancient duty and the responsibility of power and the difference between justice and vengeance. Maya took a deep breath and made her choice, and she told Vexor that she would help, but only if the Council agreed to dissolve and reform as a true federation, where all species had equal representation. Ver tried to negotiate, but Maya cut him off and said these were her only terms, and that he had 1 hour to decide before she pulled her forces back. The hour passed in tense silence, and then Vexor agreed. Though his voice was bitter with the taste of defeat, Maya immediately sent orders to Admiral Nina Brooks to mobilize the entire Alliance fleet and coordinate with Council forces for a unified defense. Defense Dr. Lauren Hayes worked around the clock with her team, preparing the dimensional bomb and running simulations to find the best deployment strategy. Carla Jensen led her pilots in constant patrols and skirmishes with swarm scouts, buying time for the main forces to assemble the Alliance and Council. Fleets gathered at a staging point just outside the core systems, and it was the largest military force ever assembled in known history. Thousands of ships filled the void, and among them flew the Stellar Wings with 200 dragons in there. Riders ready for the battle that would decide everything. Maya stood on the Bridge of Defiance, wearing armor that combined human engineering with elven craftsmanship, and she addressed the combined fleet via broadcast. She told them that what happened today would echo through history and that every being in the galaxy was counting on them to stand against the darkness. She said that old hatreds meant nothing compared to survival, and that they would fight together or die separately. The speech was simple and direct, but it struck a chord, and across the fleet both Alliance and Council crews responded with determinations. Aris stood beside Maya, channeling power through ancient rituals that would protect their forces and enhance their weapons for the coming battle. Kale flew at the head of the dragon formation, and his roar echoed across communication channels, making even hardened warriors feel brave. The swarm arrived like a tsunami of metal and malevolence, with millions of ships that moved in perfect coordination, as if controlled by a single vast intelligence. The initial clash was apocalyptic, with so many weapons firing that space itself seemed to burn, and ships from both sides were torn apart in the first moments. Maya coordinated the defense with precision born from years of warfare, and she directed forces to create overlapping fields of fire that maximized damage to the swarm. The resonance cannons proved their worth again, disrupting swarm coordination and creating gaps that conventional weapons could exploit. Dragon riders dove into the chaos with Kale leading them, and their fire carved through swarm ships while their riders fired weapons from dragon back. But for every swarm ship destroyed, 2 more appeared, and slowly the defenders were being pushed back toward the core worlds. Admiral Brooks called Maya and reported that her flank was collapsing under the weight of the swarm assault, and she needed reinforcements immediately. Maya pulled ships from the reserve and sent them to support Brooks, but she knew this was unsustainable and that they were losing Dr. Hayes contacted her with urgent news that the dimensional bomb was ready, but they needed to lure the Swarm Command Nexus into position. For it to work, the Nexus was a massive construct at the center of the Swarm fleet, and it coordinated all swarm actions across light years of specif. They could destroy it, the swarm would become disorganized and vulnerable, but getting close enough to deploy the bomb seemed impossible. Maya made a decision that was either brilliance or madness, and she called for volunteers to join her on a suicide mission to the Nexus. Serenus immediately said she would go, and Kale sent feelings of absolute Determination through their bond. Admiral Brooks wanted to come, but Maya ordered her to stay and command the fleet if this mission failed. Carla Jensen volunteered along with 50 of her best pilots and 20 Dragon Riders, who knew they probably would not return. They loaded the dimensional bomb onto a modified transport and surrounded it with the fastest ships and most skilled fighters. The plan was to punch through the swarm lines and reach the Nexus before the swarm could react, and then deploy the bomb and escape before it detonated. Maya knew the escape part was unlikely, but she did not say that out loud because her people needed hope more than honesty. Suicide Squadron launched with Kale carrying Maya and Serenus while Defiance and the escort ships followed behind. They accelerated to maximum speed and hit the swarm line like a hammer with weapons blazing and shields flaring under constant fire. Ships exploded around them, and Dragon Riders fell burning from the sky, but they pushed forward driven by desperation and duty. Kale took hit after hit, and his scales cracked and bled silver fluid, but he roared defiance and kept flying toward the Nexus. Maya held on as the dragon twisted through incoming fire, and she returned fire with her own weapons, targeting swarm ships that got too close. Serenus channeled all her power into a shield that wrapped around their formation, protecting them from the worst attacks, but the cost was terrible, and ships were falling behind. Damaged or destroyed, and the formation was breaking apart. They lost half their forces before they even reached a visual range of the Nexus, and Maya knew they would not all make it back. The Nexus appeared before them like a planet made of twisted metal and dark energy, and it was protected by thousands of swarm ships. Scale dove straight at it without hesitation, and the other dragons followed their ancient king into what seemed like certain death. The transport with the bomb fought its way through the defensive screen, and Maya ordered it to deploy the weapon at the exact center of the Nexus thaw. Pilot acknowledged and flew his ship directly into a docking port on the Nexus surface. Knowing he would not escape, Maya watched as the transport disappeared into the structure, and then the timer started counting down from 60 seconds. She ordered all forces to retreat at maximum speed. But the swarm had realized what was happening and was throwing everything at them to prevent escape. Kale turned and flew away from the Nexus as fast as his damaged wings could carry him, but swarm ships pursued and fired continuously. Dragons fell one by one, protecting the retreat, and their riders died with them in flashes of fire and fury. Carla Jensen's fighter was hit, and she spun out of control, but managed to take out 3 swarm ships before her systems failed. Maya screamed for everyone to go faster as the timer counted down, and she knew they would not make it far enough at 10 seconds remaining. Kale suddenly stopped and turned back toward the Nexus. Maya felt his intention through Serenus, and she begged him not to do it, but the dragon had made his choice. Kale flew back toward the Nexus and spread his wings wide and channeled all his remaining power into a barrier that would shield the retreating forces. Serenus was crying and trying to turn him back, but Kale sent feelings of love and pride and the knowledge that this was his purpose. The dimensional bomb detonated in reality. Self seemed to tear apart as the Nexus collapsed into a swirling vortex of energy. Kale held his position, and the barrier and the forces of the explosion crashed against his protection, but could not pass behind that barrier. The Alliance ships escaped to safety, but Kale himself was caught in the detonation, and his body was torn apart by dimensional forces that nothing could serve of evasion. Felt him die through their bond, and she screamed with grief that echoed across every communication channel Maya held her as the elf princess collapsed, and she felt tears on her own face for the dragon who had saved them all. The swarm began to collapse without the Nexus to coordinate it, and individual ships became confused and vulnerable. Admiral Brooks led the combined fleet in a devastating counterattack that destroyed swarm forces by the thousands within hours. The swarm was retreating back toward the galactic core, pursued by vengeful fleets that would hunt them to extinction. The battle was won, but the cost had been terrible, with hundreds of ships destroyed and tens of thousands dead.